We are here with Joe Stuthridge today. Joe, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I want to ask you, who are the authors that have influenced your thinking and your writing throughout the years?
During my earlier years as a counsellor, in my late 20s, early 30s, I began to discover some of the sort of feminist writers who were also writing psychoanalytically, like Nancy Chodorow, Adrienne Harris, Susie Orbach, and I think those women had quite a big impression on me because they kind of crossed that divide between the world of psychoanalysis and the social, political, feminist environment that I was working within. So at that time I was working with a community agency working with sexual abuse survivors. Byrne, of course, made a certain kind of impact. I remember reading the introduction to his 1961 text where he talks about he'd visited mental health hospitals in about over 30 different countries, and that caught my eye. I thought, this is a guy I can read. He's stepped outside his own back door and again helped cross that divide between psychotherapy and the environment that I'd been involved in up till then, which was very much involved in political, social, cultural sort of. He's writing about transactions, that there were two people involved in the model. That was important to me. I did want to mention, so one book in particular that I think was quite a crucial turning point for me, and that was coming across an article and then a book by Jodie Davies and Gail Frawley, which was about treating adult survivors of sexual abuse. So I think that was the first time I'd seen a really in-depth psychoanalytic approach to work with child sexual abuse, which is of course what I'd been doing for 10 years. That was the first time I think I'd really seen my clinical experience reflected accurately in theory. And again, they were crossing that divide between real life, real experience, external events like sexual abuse, and intrapsychic conflict in the whole world of fantasy. So that their work had a huge impact on me. And then I developed a much deeper interest in psychoanalytic writers who I had not been so interested in before then.
It sounds like you found all these authors kind of searching for a way to bring the theory into a more concrete experience that you were observing and having at the same time.
Yeah, when I look back, I think it was writers who helped bridge that divide between the internal and intrapsychic world and the real world, where I'd been involved more politically with women's groups and anti-racism groups. So I was working with racism, sexual violence, and then developed an interest in psychotherapy from there.
Okay.
So then once I discovered transactional analysis, Bill Cornell's early article on script, I remember discovering that, because at the time I was training, it wasn't an article that was handed to me by a trainer, so I felt like I'd discovered it all by myself, wading through hard copies. We didn't have anything online.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about using stories in a constructive way, using script in a constructive way, which I think, struck a chord with me in some way.
So when did you decide to start writing yourself?
Well, I don't think I ever decided to start writing. I think writing for me has always been something a bit more, it's happened by accident, really. And my first TA publication was, again, it was a presentation I'd done, which then somebody asked to put in a little New Zealand newsletter. I thought that was okay. And then someone saw it and put it in an ITA newsletter. And it sort of got that wider exposure, which left me feeling a little anxious, actually. So it's not something I set out to do. However, it has become something quite compulsive, and I have kept writing, so some part of me has chosen to do that.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps your relationship to writing has also changed over the years.
Yeah, I guess so. I think it still has the same kind of compelling, compulsive, creative kind of motive behind it as it did when I was a little kid and I enjoyed writing stories. I mean, I've always loved books and stories, and I used to tell stories to my siblings. So there's something that's very similar. And I mean, writing about psychotherapy, in some sense, is an attempt to make sense of the work, I guess.
So when you write, I mean, I assume you start off with an idea, and I'm curious if the ideas or the concepts that you write about change or evolve as you go deeper into the writing.
Well, I think it's something that I tend to see in hindsight, what I write about. Like, I notice looking back that there are very consistent threads.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I don't think it's something I've set out to write in that way. But that first publication was about stories, and it was about a remarkable discovery I thought I'd made at the time, reading and doing some workshops with adult attachment research. So it was the discovery that a parent who develops a coherent narrative in that adult attachment way of thinking is likely to have a securely attached child. I mean, it really thought it was quite mind-blowing at the time. And I've noticed that, you know, my writing is about making sense of things, creating coherent narratives, using story in creative, constructive, growthful ways.
And that whole process is very much informed by the experience that you've had with all these different groups, like working with survivors of child abuse or with women, and you've had personal and professional experiences with other kinds of groups. Can you tell us more about this and how this has influenced your thinking and writing about TA concepts?
Writing, it's always been a struggle. I really struggled to find a voice in groups when I was much younger. But I spent my 20s completely immersed in political groups of all kinds, women's groups, anti-racism groups.
When you say anti-racism groups, what do you mean?
Yeah, it probably has quite a New Zealand context. Okay, when I was 19, so New Zealand's a big rugby nation. It's probably aware it's been going on in the background the last week. So sporting contact with South Africa became quite controversial in my late teens. And when I was 19, there was a tour by a Springbok team, and what we had was sort of mass political protest. So I was involved in that very early on, and I suppose it was quite a life-changing kind of experience in some way. I met my beloved, whom I'm still with, in a prison cell after we spent the night together overnight. And then from there became involved in domestic racism, working with groups towards Māori sovereignty, and then wider networks working towards independence for Indigenous people in the Pacific. So I spent a lot of years running workshops, which in New Zealand we would call treaty workshops or anti-racism workshops. So raising consciousness about colonialisation, racism, that kind of thing.
So what would you say was the most difficult thing about these meetings?
Learning to work with difference, I think. Well, I mean, it's a huge question. I think what I learned through political groups was I mean, where I became disillusioned at some point, I think, was an overemphasis on analysis, confrontation, a lack of attention to personal dynamics. And then from there, it kind of overlapped. At the same time, I was working with with this community agency, which was run by a collective, and I worked with groups of sexual abuse survivors in that setting. And there we were using Rogerian, feminist, client-centred methods of working, and there was probably an over-reliance on safety and empathy eventually for me, in a way that kind of limited growth. So they were quite safe in the way that the political groups could be quite harsh and confrontative.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from there I looked to psychotherapy with a deeper interest in intrapsychic processes and group work processes. So my first training in transactional analysis was through a course on group work. I was just looking for group work training. It happened to be transactional analysis.
That takes us back to TA and the TA concept. And I remember you coined this phrase that sometimes script can turn into scripture. And, what you just said now about relying too much on empathy or staying too much into an area of conflict, I suppose there are also ways where you can get fixated into, I guess, a way of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very interesting that you found psychotherapy as a response or searching for a way to have more impact at a social level.
Was I looking for ways to have an impact at a social level? I guess I've always been deeply interested in subversive activities and creating change. At one point, the field of action was the external political world, and then I got more interested in the internal, intrapsychic worlds. And actually, that first proper article I wrote, Inside Out, was probably some attempt to make sense of all that experience, about how external experience gets internalised and then shapes our perception of the outside.